Town Bank Mortgage, NMLS number 512138, is an equal housing lender. This podcast is for informational purposes only. And now, the man born with a 5 o'clock shadow and with the NMLS number 2028-201. He is a gentleman. He is a scholar. He is
Tyler Cralle.
All right, welcome everyone to the latest edition of the Cape Fear Report. I, of course, am the host, Tyler Cralle, loan officer at Town Bank Mortgage right here in Wilmington, North Carolina. And as I mentioned, I've been doing some interesting interviews recently with candidates kind of moving away from realtors and other people kind of in the real estate business and focusing on, well, an industry that has a big impact on real estate, and that, of course, would be politics. And so last week I had Richard Collier on, and today joining me here in studio is J.C. Lyle, of course, running for Wilmington City Council. And J.C., thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
You're bringing me back to my roots. It's very early here. It is before 9 a.m., and I used to do a radio show that was on from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., and so I haven't done an interview this early in the morning in probably 5 years, so I appreciate that, bringing me back to my roots.
You're welcome.
And speaking of roots, let's kind of give a little background on are you from Wilmington originally?
I'm from Virginia originally.
Okay.
I moved to Wilmington in 1996 and jumped right into volunteering, and housing quickly became my favorite thing and the purpose of my life, because housing is so related to everything else in life. So I'm excited to be here with your listeners, with your viewers, my people.
So, what's interesting is I talked about kind of, I deal with a lot of people who are in real estate, a lot of realtors, real estate attorneys, insurance, everything else. But even though you're not in one of those professions, you have been, as you mentioned, working in housing kind of your whole career. And so kind of talk about the various positions that you've held. And like I said, a lot of it's with affordable housing.
That's right. I do have a background in land planning and preliminary civil engineering before I moved into the nonprofit sector. And I also had done a lot of volunteer work in response to Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Over 20 years ago now. So I'd kind of, in my professional life and volunteer life, kind of helped with different types of housing issues, whether that was helping design subdivisions or helping people repair their homes after hurricanes. And so it became a natural fit for me to serve as the director of Wilmington Area Rebuilding Ministry, WARM NC, because it kind of combined all those skills and interests and passions into one job. And we served about 44 households a year when I started, and we were doing repairs for homeowners who couldn't afford it otherwise, seniors and veterans and single moms. And 15 years later, when I left, we were serving 7 counties, over 400 people a year, 400 households a year. So it just showed me that was a great need, especially after Hurricane Florence, to help people stay in their homes. And of course, we know that is a great way to help lift families out of poverty when they can maintain and hold on to their home and pass it to the next generation.
So that's what WARM basically does, is that after there's a disaster or of some extent, that's you guys help people who can't afford the repairs stay in their homes.
Right. And when there's no disaster, we just focus on, a lady's heat goes out in September, and it's going to be a cold winter, and she makes $16,000 a year, and it's $6,000, for a new unit. So the math just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
We have to help keep them in their home. They're homeowners, so they had put tens of thousands of dollars of their own money into real estate in our region. And the best thing for society, and of course for them, is to keep them in their home and keep that affordable housing unit in service.
Yeah, I mean, and so so I guess that's all funded by, I'm assuming, so it is a nonprofit, so it's all donations is how that's funded, and I guess grants as well.
A lot of donations, a lot of government contracts. So we were really fortunate to be able to grow that fast, and the government funding was a big part of that. Our staff, it was outstanding, and still it's just a great organization, and you can't attract and administer properly the millions of dollars that we were bringing in without having that infrastructure in place.
And so, so you're not with WARM right now, right?
Correct.
So what do you What's your job right now? Trying to think of a good way to say that.
Right. So last year I moved to Wesley Community Development.
Okay.
And Wesley is new to Wilmington, but has been around since 2002, mostly serving the western side of North Carolina. But as they were growing across the state, they needed somebody in the eastern side, and so
Gotcha.
I was excited to work with them. They have a great reputation. I've known about them for a long time. So what we do is work exclusively with faith-based organizations and nonprofits. Sometimes we help them with their facilities. And sometimes we will build affordable housing on their property. So it all depends on what the church wants to do, but that's where lots of space we operate in as far as the community development and the housing.
Well, I mean, that's clearly probably the biggest issue, not just in a city council race, but in really any race, any local race, is development. And
That's right.
Obviously Wilmington has seen some tremendous growth. Not as much, of course, as the surrounding areas. They've, just because we can't grow as much because we don't have as much land and possibility as they do. But I mean, with development being the biggest issue, and there's this real big divide on this issue among a lot of people who live here. You got people that live here who say we don't want to build anymore, and then you got people that, of course, want to move here, and they obviously want to see building happen so they can move here. How do you kind of balance that? Because, like I said, there is so much like vitriol against a lot of developers out there, but at the same time, they are needed because otherwise, I mean, home prices have risen by a lot. If we weren't building at the rate that we were, I can't even imagine where home prices would be.
Right. And it's not that building more is going to bring prices down, but it does help mitigate some of this natural economics 101 supply and demand issues there. But the city, and I was on the planning commission for 6 years, and the city heard and the city council at that time as well, heard the cry for housing affordability. And part of that, not all of it, but part of that is getting more units on the ground to increase the supply. And so that's what's been happening over the past few years. And we've been putting people close to services, so that keeps them off the road longer. And with 57% of the city limits taken up by single-family homes that not everyone can afford. Really didn't have a lot of choice but to put it with the commercial. But it does make sense from an urban planning standpoint. The closer you put people to where they work and where they go get their haircut and get their groceries, the fewer miles they'll be driving. So that helps mitigate the traffic. Again, probably not going to make it better, but it helps mitigate as we grow. So those are a few things we can do to help.
Well, I mean, it does seem like everyone is in support of single family. Like anytime you're like, oh, we're going to build a new development, and if it's single family, you don't hear a lot of anger. Once you start moving into the multifamily, I don't really know. We don't have a lot of duplexes here. It seems to be it's either single family or apartments and condos. And so whenever anyone hears, oh, there's going to be apartments, people automatically get angry about that. Condos automatically angry about that. Like I said, townhomes a little less. But so how do we deal with that? Because the reality is, to your point, is that even building more single family, we just don't have that much space. That is a higher price point. And there are people that just aren't going to be able to afford that single family versus like a condo or something along those lines. Right.
And there is, folks get offended by driving past a 4-story apartment building for some reason. I came from Raleigh, and a few weeks ago I had a conference in Raleigh, and I thought, in Wilmington, we don't really like 4-story buildings, and there are these huge buildings in Raleigh downtown. So a lot of folks don't. They may have moved from larger cities, and they moved to Wilmington because they didn't want to live in a larger city. So, so that's kind of where they are. But one thing you said was really key. There's not a lot of in between single family and apartments.
Yeah.
So in the land development code, when we revised it a few years ago, we helped reduce some of the barriers to creating duplexes and townhouses and even quads, so that those units can come online. So there's a middle ground for people, for whether they just need a little more space in a rental, or whether that's their starter home. And for me, I was lucky. I had a little condo downtown. That was my first thing that I owned myself. And so, just over time, as you put money into your investment, you can you move up the chain a little bit.
Well, I mean, it does seem like that's sort of, coming at it from, my perspective as a loan officer, what's happened is that sort of housing cycle is frozen, where you have people that can't get into their starter home because home prices have jumped up so much. And then you have, people who are retired, people who maybe normally would be downsizing. They're sort of looking at the numbers and being like, well, my house is paid off and maybe downsizing isn't that much of an advantage. And so they're staying. And so you have people who are trying to get into a starter home, but the starter home people maybe can't move up because they're locked in with the 2.5% rate. And so nothing's moving. And so the life cycle where you go starter home, kind of a next home, dream home, and then you downsize, no one's moving. And so the only way to get houses is to build them onto into the inventory pool. And then, as you mentioned, if you're building single family, that's a price point that some people just can't afford. And we just don't have a lot of that sort of multi-mix. But, what I do like about, townhomes and duplexes is that they can blend a little better with maybe a single family neighborhood. So if you do have some lots, you could maybe build some duplexes that maybe wouldn't have the same aesthetic as an apartment complex, because it does seem like, and this is something I talked with Richard about, where it does seem like a lot of people, it's not so much that they're against multifamily, they just don't like the way they look. And they think that they're very different looking than what you'd want to see, where it's like, more green space and trees and all this other stuff than just one giant building. Right. And so it seems like it is kind of almost an aesthetic argument versus a sort of logistical argument about multifamily, single family. It's like, we just like the way single family looks. So if you can make multifamily look more like single family, you might be able to win more people over, it seems.
Right. It's definitely a big part of it. A lot of the duplexes and triplex designs have only one of the doors on the front, for example. Yeah. So it looks like a single family home, and maybe the other tenants or owners enter on the side. So there are some really creative ways that the design can help maintain the character of the neighborhood while still increasing a little bit of density here and there. And what I love about those missing middle, we call them missing middle products between the apartments and the single family, you have the missing middle. What I like about those is that it can increase a little density here, a little density there, so that you kind of scatter out units that are more naturally affordable. Mm-hmm. So people have more options of where they want to live. So instead of corralling everyone into, these apartment buildings, they have more options for where they want to live.
Oh, so what you're saying is that you can kind of, instead of just having one neighborhood that's all apartments, you can kind of have multifamily scattered throughout different neighborhoods.
Yeah,
so yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, you kind of see that used to be sort of the way to look at it, because you look at like a higher placed area, like the country club area, right? Where you got single family homes that are like over $1 million easily starter. But you do have some single family, like Oleander Court, obviously that's something else. But you also have a little, like some townhomes that have been there for a while. And you wouldn't think that would be where a townhouse would be, because now it's like we do sort of section things off, where it's like, this is where townhouses go. This is where single family goes. This is where apartment buildings go. This is where condos go. And it's like, we did used to mix it a lot more back in the day, and things have kind of changed.
Well, and some of the zoning laws over time were created to separate people by class. Mm-hmm. So the folks who could afford wealth, more high dollar real estate, they didn't want to live near people who couldn't even afford a home and had to rent a townhouse or something. So some of it, the intention behind it way back when was a little more of a caste system, whereas today we're just so used to it, it just seems more of like a natural aesthetic change in when we drive past, and there's some differences in the units.
Well, and what's interesting too is that there also seems to be, and I think this is mostly among, I would say, probably older people, is that they see apartment buildings as like, oh, if you're in an apartment, then you don't make a lot of money. Like it's a different kind of person. When in reality, I mean, you go downtown and you have these apartments that are like 3 bedrooms and they're renting for like $6,000 a month. Like, you realize you got to make like $20,000 to qualify for that apartment a month. And so this is not like lower. It's like there has been this sort of, for some reason, I guess because maybe. Yeah, for so long, I mean, housing was so, compared to now, affordable. And so it was like, the apartments you did see a different kind of person that was in an apartment, where now you have these luxury apartments, which also get a lot of criticism. And I guess that's sort of a question I want to ask you about, because people get angry when they see luxury developments come in and they say, who's that helping? That's only helping these rich people. We need, workforce housing. But the argument that I think makes sense is that, anything that's adding to the inventory is going to have at least some downward pressure on prices. And so if you were to get on the council, would you want to see just exclusively more workforce housing, or would you like to just find a way to bring all types of more housing to the Wilmington area?
Definitely all types, so people have choices. Really focused on getting some of that missing middle on the ground. And for the larger developments, especially the ones calling themselves the luxury, so they can change. I mean, they're trying to change the viewpoint of apartments more so than I think making the most dollar. I think they're trying to get rid of that stigma of apartments when they call themselves luxury, and they are beautiful. I've submitted them, some of them. But one of my favorite things to do with some of those projects, when I was on Planning Commission, we redid the codes, and one of our big things was to put more incentives, better incentives for putting a percentage of workforce units in market rate developments. And again, the same principle, you're spreading out some of the workforce housing units so that people have choices. Even though they don't have as much money, they still have choices of where they can live. They can live closer to work maybe, or closer to their kids' school, or the school that they want their kids to go to. So those are the things I'd like to focus on. Before I got on Planning Commission, there were some incentives for workforce housing, but nobody used them because they were not very robust. But especially after Hurricane Florence, so the people were really crying out for, we see the importance of getting housing that families can afford, that my employees can afford, that our firefighters and teachers can afford. So there was a real push for that, and now the public is crying out for, hey, we're kind of using up all the green space here, y'all. So that's something that the next city council will need to make sure that we pay attention to, are the negative aspects of the population growth. So certainly there's so many great things about the population growth. For example, I moved here in 1996. The man who I met and eventually married didn't move here till about 10 years later. So I'm happy for so all you single ladies out there. So there's certainly some of the negative impacts of having such a wave we've had since the pandemic made it so easy to live in a wonderful place like Wilmington and work in another city. So those are the things we need to catch up on infrastructure.
Well, what was kind of funny was that, I would say between, I think it was 1990 and 2010, I think Wilmington maybe doubled in size. I think that was the stat that I saw. And everyone kind of went, whoa, that was a lot of growth. That's not going to happen again. And then the 2010s were a little slower, but then the pandemic hit and we saw crazy growth. And so it seems like we are reaching kind of a point because, I think there's only 10% of buildable land that's left that's sort of vacant. And we could, maybe use existing properties and upfit them or something along those lines. But it does feel like we are getting to a point where we just can't grow as much without it severely impacting home prices and everything else. But so how do we manage the growth kind of going forward? Because it doesn't seem like we're going to have another spurt like that. But then, like I said, we didn't think that was going to happen again.
Knock on wood.
And so how would you like to manage that if you were on the council?
One of the biggest complaints I heard is the traffic.
Yeah.
So it's the green space and the traffic and the housing affordability, those three things. And for traffic, the most congested areas are owned by DOT.
Okay.
So pushing DOT, working with DOT, making sure that the projects that DOT is putting money into are the ones that are most important to Wilmingtonians, the ones that are going to make the most difference in the traffic flow. So the city is only growing by 2%. It's the counties that are growing by double digits. But it doesn't matter, that 2%, the city's only growing by 2%. It doesn't matter if you're sitting at 3 cycles at the light at Oleander in College. That doesn't matter. It matters what the Wilmingtonians' experience is day to day. And so those are some things we need to look at. I'd love to see more tree-lined medians and something where we're putting more street trees, again, with the aesthetics.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of people's experience in Wilmington is what it looks like, what it feels like, how fast I can get places, what's available to me, restaurants, and grocery stores and things like that.
Well, so, You mentioned the other areas. Obviously, Pender, Brunswick County, tremendous growth. I think Brunswick was one of the top 5 in the country with regards to growth at one point. And so just a lot of growth. Pender, of course, has seen a ton of growth. Do you think it would help if there were more, because we're already kind of seeing that with the growth of Leland and then kind of a little bit on the outskirts of Leland and Brunswick County, just more, dining options, more shopping options. And so, back in the day, if you were in Leland, you pretty much had to come into Wilmington for most of your shopping needs or just to live. Doctors and everyone was up there. But now you're seeing growth in Leland, in Brunswick County. You're also seeing it, of course, now in Pender. And so do you think that will help with the congestion issue, is that the fewer people on the outskirts that don't have to come into Wilmington, that will provide at least some relief for Wilmington as they kind of expand and get more services?
Absolutely. I see that same thing happening, and it will certainly make a difference over time. Again, mitigating, maybe not reducing the traffic coming into Wilmington, which is, I think it's up close to 100,000 cars coming into Wilmington a day. But it's a double-edged sword, because Wilmington businesses really benefit from people driving in, spending money here, people who work here. And so we have to be careful with, affordable housing is over the bridge. They're good. Because they don't have to drive into Wilmington anymore for a job. Yeah. Like, they'll find a job over there, and we need them. Like, I want them to work here. Yeah. I want them to live here near their places of employment. So we need to make sure that that's something that's attainable, and it's not right now.
I did want to go back, because you were talking about, with the workforce housing and say you're building like a luxury apartment complex, and then they provide a few units are workforce housing. And so you had mentioned grant. You think grants are the better way to go, because it does seem like that would be the better way to go. But then the other, I guess, route would be to require them to have X amount of units. And I've talked to builders about that, and they'll say, well, then all we have to do, we pass that cost on to the other units. And so then rents go up for everyone else. And so a few people benefit, and then most people do not benefit. And so you think grants are the better way to go, tax credits, things like that, versus sort of a regulation that kind of puts more of the work on the builder? Yeah,
well, the regulations are illegal in North Carolina. Okay. So there's no stick, so it's all carrots.
Okay, gotcha.
So the carrots in our land development code are incentives, so density incentives. If you build these, 15 units and keep them at a certain affordability rate for 15 years, you can build more units than the zoning would normally allow you, so that you can make up the cost. So that doesn't happen that, okay, now we have to charge 20% more for all the other units. Like, there's some math here that we can't ignore when we're, creating policy. I live in the real world. So there's also the grants are usually for, like, the tax credit housing you mentioned. Starway that just opened is a tax credit project. That's what my company does, is build tax credit projects. And they're great for getting a great volume of on the ground of workforce housing units on the ground. I've heard a lot of complaints that the prices are still really high. Yeah. And HUD creates those maximum levels of a rent based on your area median income. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a lot of wealth in New Hanover and Brunswick and Pender counties. And so when we're building tax credit housing in New Hanover County, it's based on the median income for the area. So it's not anything that the developer decides. It's something decided by HUD. I promise you, with these tax credit housing, there's nothing the developer decides except who to hire to put the shovels in the ground. So there's a lot of regulation with those. Yeah. And it's a lot of compliance, energy, regulations and things like that. And so I really applaud the developers who are willing to take those on.
Do you think there's, do you think it's a good amount of regulation? You think it's too much, too little? Because, you obviously look at what's happening in a lot of places. California is probably the best example, where they recently just passed some legislation to make it easy to rebuild after the wildfires. And, because there's been almost no rebuilding because of it's so, the regulations are so stringent that you can't build it or even make sense to build. And so you just have seen nothing happen. They can't get the permits. They can't do that. And so how do you feel about this area, obviously working in the field? Do you feel that there's too much, too little, or you think it's kind of in a good place with regards to what we require of builders?
I think we'll always need to keep our eye on the numbers, like the occupancy rates and the the permitting, like how long does it take to get permits? You know, how can we make that time frame a little shorter, because time is money when you're building. And again, if it takes you longer to build, that cost is going to be passed on. So how do we there's just some small things that we can do to kind of help with the cost of housing, but we'll always need to adjust. And one of the other numbers I look at is we have as you may have heard in the news, there's some attention right now on our homelessness issue.
Yes.
The number I look at with homelessness is 79% of the unhoused counted last year they were experiencing homelessness for the first time. So 79%, that's a lot of folks who are going into these homeless systems. Mm-hmm. And it's very expensive and traumatic for them to get them back into permanent housing. So there's people out there right now who are housed who we're going to be counting next year. Like, how do we find them right now? How do we keep them in their homes so that they're not in the homelessness system next year? Way more efficient, money-wise, to keep them in their homes. Reduces and eliminates a lot of trauma, if there's children involved especially. And how do we keep people in their homes? When I was working at Warm, of course, we were keeping people in their homes by making repairs that they couldn't afford otherwise. But are there rental assistance programs and foreclosure prevention? And how do we keep people who are in jeopardy of becoming part of the homelessness system? How do we keep them housed?
Well, you do talk about on your website, you mentioned, how homeownership is way out of poverty. And there's no doubt about that, because, when you buy a house and you get a mortgage, it's, a lot of times we have seen some crazy appreciation recently with regards to home prices jumping 20% most ever, I think, in the history of housing. That's not normal, but, normally you're looking at 1 or 2% a year appreciation, maybe a little bit more, just trying to stay up with inflation. But really what it is, it's sort of like a forced savings account where it's like, you're paying down your mortgage, and then after 30 years, you have this house that has this equity in it. You can sell the house. You can, cash out, refi, something along those lines. So there's no doubt that is a benefit. But do you think it almost creates, in some cases, sort of like a perverse disincentive where people want to see their home values go up? And so we live in this kind of weird world, from an economics perspective, where everyone complains about, the cost of housing, but then at the same time, they don't want to see new homes being built. And so it's like you want your house to go up in value, but you want your kid to be able to buy a house. And so we had this weird thing where it's like people want their houses to go up in value because it's more money for them. But then when it's doing that, it does make homeownership more difficult. And so I guess, how do you balance that when you're talking to voters? Because you're going to have people that really want their home values to go up, and then people that want to get into a home for the first time.
Right. And it depends on the area. So there's certain nodes, for example, in town that have been selected through the public process of creating a comprehensive plan for the city. So those nodes are identified as, okay, here's where we need more density. And there's other areas that are not appropriate for density. So it's not necessarily a citywide policy that would cover all of that. It takes digging into the details of the local, the community, the local community, and making sure that we're doing what's appropriate there. So that helps balance a little bit the home prices that that people would like to see their investment pay off, and also helps put density and potentially lower housing costs in other areas. So that is the biggest way we can look at that.
Yeah, one of the funniest kind of jokes online that they have with regards to housing is it does seem like a lot of times elected officials focus almost exclusively on kind of the demand side. This is obviously more on a national level where it's like, hey, we got to get mortgage rates lower so people can get into homes, or, we got to find a way to almost, or tax credits, for sort of the purchaser side. But then of course on the supply side, it's about helping developers, but there's sort of this catch-22 where, it's like, we got to help developers, but if you're helping developers, then you're helping developers. Like, there's probably no group that gets more ire online than developers. I mean, people just are not a fan of them. And so I guess, once again, how do you balance that? Because you do want to provide some resources to help people, whether it's getting a mortgage. We have things like NC Housing in North Carolina where you can almost do 100% financing to encourage people to get into a home, but you do need that demand side. And I know you talked about sort of tax credits earlier with helping them create more, sort of workforce housing. But what if you're, building like townhouses? And so are there things that you can do to help the developer, encourage them to sort of build a duplex instead of a single family home?
Yes, through regulations.
Okay.
Especially when a rezoning is required, and they do a conditional district rezoning. So that means whatever you promise you're going to do, that's exactly what you do, versus just a regular general rezoning that says, okay, you can do anything that is allowed in this zoning district, but the council prefers conditional district rezoning so that they can review the site plan and the tree protection, and even if there's some incentives that the developer is using, like the workforce housing incentives. So it's a pretty tight rezoning process that we have. So that is one way to do that, one way to help.
And then we mentioned trees a couple times. That was that recent story where I think it was on Wrightsville Avenue where they cut some of the trees down, and people really got angry about that. How do you see that sort of moving forward? I know that they've recently passed a new tree ordinance, and sort of, I mean, once again, that's sort of the aesthetic argument, because there's no real value other than it just looks better. And so how important do you think kind of that is going forward with regards to sort of the aesthetic debate?
Oh, it's very important, because trees, especially the mature trees, they absorb water. And we're a flood-prone area.
Yes.
So the more mature trees, the more chance we have that the flooding won't completely devastate our community, like has happened before. So the more mature trees we can keep, it does a lot more than just look lovely, which is my favorite benefit, but also is there to help with storm resilience, help with overall physical and mental health, with the trees breathing, they breathe. I got a nice lesson. One of the first people I talked to before I ran was the Tree Alliance, and so I got a nice lesson on all the benefits of trees. It was really, really insightful. So those are some ways. When we redid the land development code, we made it illegal to do clear cutting. There are a lot stronger tree protections, so that we've built up a tree mitigation fund of, I think it's up to about $1.5 million. And some of the trees that are being planted now, a lot of street trees, are from that tree mitigation fund. So, and the developments that people see now that might appear to be clear cutting, most of those were approved before the ordinance. So they're still in compliance. They're just in compliance with the ordinance that isn't the one that is going to be going forward.
Gotcha. Talking about flooding, that's obviously a big issue. I mean, I think it's more of an issue it seems like kind of the newer areas, and maybe Brunswick and Pender, less so here, just because once again, there's not as many places to build. So it's not as big of an issue. But I mean, there are parts of Wilmington where you do see just like when I was talking to Richard, I mentioned, like Racine, like every time it rains a little bit, it floods. and you're hearing a lot of, concerns from people because, in this area, especially in the summer, we do get these just crazy rainstorms and just a lot of rain really quickly, and it has nowhere to go. And so, I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, trees are a good way to do that. What are some other things that you think that we need to be doing to encourage development, but also make sure, once again, it's responsible, where you don't have that flooding with the new projects? Yeah.
When we look for park space, I want to make sure we're looking in the low-lying areas that can serve not only as pretty green space, but also kind of a sponge park, they call them, where if it's raining and you're at the low point, that's where all the water's going to run, of course, if it can't be taken care of in on-site stormwater systems. But we want it to go to a vacant land. We want it to go to an open space. So that is one thing I'd like to focus on as we grow and get more park space and green space as a city, and put our money into that it's going to serve two purposes. I'm always going to look for efficiency and the most bang for our buck. That's why I love housing, and that's why I love the green space that can also absorb stormwater. So that's one way we can do it. And moving forward, that's one of my favorite best practices I've seen out there as I've done my research.
I did want to talk a little bit about downtown Wilmington. I'm a big fan of downtown. It's seen just some amazing things happen in the last 10, 20 years. Have been pretty awesome. And a lot of people have said that there's still tons of room for growth. I mean, I think I talked to Commissioner Dane Scalise here on this podcast, and he had mentioned that downtown seems to be a better fit for a lot of these more high density projects. And you don't seem to get the same pushback that you would get from like more residential single family. And so do you think that there's still a lot more that can be done? I mean, we've seen like obviously great things in downtown, but do you think that is a place where maybe we could have higher buildings and you're just not going to hear the same concerns from citizens because we already have higher buildings, like, Skyline Center. We already have high buildings down there. And so it's not going to be a big of a problem if you have a 7-story building.
That's right. I think the height maximum in most of the downtown, the central business district, I think most of the heights, the maximum is about 96 feet. So, so you can do a lot in 96 feet. So, so I'm hopeful that as our capacity for investing in projects like that and our understanding of where density belongs and where it doesn't, that will really help downtown grow even more. So, and get the critical mass that's needed for new businesses and a grocery store.
Yes,
for example,
that would be great.
And to have folks who work down there be able to live down there as well. So I definitely see downtown as and it's changed a lot. I moved here in 1996, and that's. It was a little rough then, and so that was one of the Mayor Safo's big commitments to downtown, and you can see it's really paid off over the years. It's a completely different downtown than when I moved here. Well,
and so in the balance that you have between, because Project Grace, they just opened up part of it. They're going to hopefully open up the full part. I think in 26 is sort of the timeline, I believe. And it's amazing, looks amazing. Has really completely changed that kind of block where, it was just this sort of kind of dilapidated area, and it just looks so much better. But there was pushback from, some in the historic community that thought that Belk building should be saved. And, they couldn't because I think it was something with the zoning, and the building had been changed, and so it wasn't technically a historical building anymore. And I understand, wanting to save old buildings. I mean, I remember reading an article back from, I think it was the 80s. They were thinking about getting rid of the historic courthouse that was built in 1891. In the 80s, or I think it was the 70s or 80s, they were talking about tearing it down because they wanted to build a new one. And thank God they didn't, because it is such an integral part of sort of downtown skyline. But at the same time, it's like we want to make sure we're saving those buildings. But then other buildings, we can let them go. Like, we don't need. It's like I think there was somewhere in California where they were trying to save a parking garage because they argued it had like a historical precedent because it had been there for like 40 years. And it's like, it's a parking garage. Like, what are you guys doing?
And so the president stop and park there for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I think it was because it was part of another building and it was a store. I mean, it was guys, it's a parking garage, and there's nothing historic about it. And so how do we balance that? Because we do want to maintain the character of downtown Wilmington. It's so amazing with the buildings and even the historic homes. But at the same time, we do need to kind of grow. And I think getting rid of the Belk building and putting in this Project Grace is going to be a tremendous benefit to downtown. So how would you kind of balance that if you're on the council?
Yeah, each project, of course, needs to be looked at individually. And each historic structure. I'm working with a client on on a historic structure now, and we'd like to replace the windows, and no. So the windows don't even open, so we'll have to figure something else out besides getting some new windows. So yeah, there is a lot. I've heard a lot of people who live downtown near a boundary for a zoning or registry historic district, and they don't even want to be in it because of and we've had, when I was building for Warm, we couldn't build wheelchair ramp. We were denied permits for a wheelchair ramp on the front of a house, things like that. So there are certainly ways we can have some common sense leadership, insert some of our influence over specific jobs. But I do believe that the historic properties are such a special part of downtown. And as we grow and as we need to expand roads and things like that, having a fund set aside that can preserve some buildings, maybe move them. Part of my housing trust fund idea, it's not my original idea, but I serve on the state's housing trust fund board. And so I've helped allocate millions of dollars all over the state for projects that leverage private investment and build units, get units on the ground for seniors, folks with disabilities, people who are coming out of human trafficking experiences. So I'd like to do a housing trust fund here with help from, the endowment and some of the, maybe a land transfer fee or something to help keep some of it going. And what that would do is keep our prosperity here, help invest more in Wilmington's housing stock. And also we can set aside some for a land bank and to have some funds to protect structures in historically black neighborhoods, for example. That, okay, you're a homeowner and you want to sell, I'm not going to tell you can't sell your house. But if you want to sell it and you want it to stay in the community, sell it to this land bank. We can hold on to it. And the community decides what to do with that. If it's a historic structure, they might decide to keep that and turn it into, and let somebody else buy it who wants to live in it, or turn it into a community center or a grocery store. Did I mention grocery store? So there are a lot of creative ways. I think sometimes we get stuck in our ways. That's not how we've done it before. But it's time to get creative about how we can maintain that balance. And so that's one of the reasons I'm running.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you mentioned what you're talking about. There's this big debate about property rights. And it's like, what can you do on your property? And obviously people have dealt with HOAs, and that's the vast majority of neighborhoods now, it seems like. They're HOAs. They're now advertising homes that aren't in HOAs. It's like a plus. But then, of course, there's also things that you can't do just because there's regulations, there's zoning. And so, that is sort of a very interesting debate because most people would think that it's partisan when really it's not. When really you have Republicans that are, 100% pro property rights and don't want the government telling them what to do. But then at the same time, you also have Democrats that also think the same thing. And then vice versa. The Republicans who are like, absolutely, you can't build a duplex right next to my single family home because that's,
right.
And so it is sort of this sort of nonpartisan or kind of nonpartisan issue where you're seeing Republicans and Democrats on both sides of sort of the property rights debate. But I mean, to me, this, I guess, kind of goes back to what you were talking about with sort of balancing, you want to have good regulations to make sure, things are being built properly, but not so onerous that it discourages building.
That's right.
And so, I mean, do you think and so with regards to property rights, is that sort of kind of in that debate where it's letting people know, hey, it's your property, but you can't build like like we mentioned grocery store. You couldn't build a grocery store in a single family zoning. Like
right.
You have to go to the council and get them to change the rules and everything like that. And that's good for everyone. It's not good that you can just do whatever you want on your property
that's
for
right.
everyone else, even if you're not an HOA.
Right. And that's exactly why we have zoning. And some localities are more restrictive than others. And so we're always going to need to keep our eye on that balance. And where are we? Maybe we're balanced. Maybe we're balanced in the year 2000, and by the year 2005, we needed to adjust some things. Like there's always going to be adjustments we need to make because Wilmington's growing and changing. So we need to keep our eye on it. But property rights was, of course, a huge issue when I was on Planning Commission because neighbors would come out and say, we don't want this. And if the property owner, it's America, we're not going to, if they're in compliance with all the codes and a lot of the developments that we approved, the developer went to the city staff and said, what do you want to see here? Like they do that. They want to build what the city needs and what is going to pass through the rezoning process. So if they're following all the regulations and they're building what the city needs, and that is as defined by the comprehensive plan, which everyone has an opportunity to participate in, then there's no reason to say no. Even if there's some opposition to it. So that's the hard part because when you live somewhere, you're really emotionally attached to where you live. You put a lot of money into it. And so people feel threatened by what is happening in their neighborhood that is outside of their control. So I think it's only natural that some people have those feelings. And I don't take it, it's natural that they come out against something. But in the end, we really do have to follow that. But I will add that in next year, the comprehensive plan will be revisited and revised. And I want to make sure, that's one reason I want to be on city council at this time, is that I want to make sure that all the public is aware of those, because I hear that all the time, the public should have some input. Yeah, you should. So please come out next year and participate in these public sessions where we get to hear from what the public wants and make sure that it's incorporated into the comprehensive plan, because that's what all of our other regulations are based on.
Yeah. No, I mean, it definitely getting involved. I was on the Citizens Advisory Council with the WMPO, and it was like pulling teeth to try and get people to fill out these surveys about what they wanted to do. And, everyone's like, oh, we want more walkability, but they really kind of don't. Like, they say that, but then they'll be against a project that would make something close to the house they could walk to. So it's like, I don't know if you really want walkability. I think it sounds like a good idea, but people then tell you by how they vote on things what they actually do care about. And so, yeah, I mean, public input is obviously very important, because it does, so people know, hey, we don't want that in our neighborhood. And so maybe the developer's like, all right, I'm not going to build that because I don't want to deal with the hostility. And so the more people hey, we don't want that. But sometimes there are people that do want it. And it does seem like the anti-people are always louder than the people who are like, yeah, I wouldn't mind that being there. And it's kind of realizing that. I think it's another issue that it's kind of hard for people in elected office, is knowing that sometimes the loudest group is actually a pretty small group. They just happen to be the loudest, where the vast majority of people are like, I'm okay with that.
Well, and sometimes the planning best practices are contrary to kind of the surface view. So what I mean is when people see the apartments going up, for example, behind Hanover Center, apartments near grocery stores, and that is a great planning best practice to get people near, as we mentioned, what we talked about before, people near services so they can walk or ride their bike instead of driving on the road. But when you see all the apartments going up, you think, wow, all these people are going to be on the roads. So it's kind of contrary.
Yeah.
It's counterintuitive when you see apartments going up. It really is you have to put them in the right place so that it mitigates traffic, not makes it 10 times worse.
Well, JC, I know you're busy. I could probably go for another hour, but I do appreciate you taking the time. Do you have a website for people to go to and visit?
That's right, electjclyle.com.
And early voting is the 16th, is that right?
That's right.
So that's tomorrow? Oh. We are recording this on the 15th. I will be releasing it after early voting started. And then election day is?
November 4th, Tuesday, November 4th.
So. All right, well, JC.
Less than 3 weeks to go. I did want to mention, if you have a moment, that I'm so proud to have been endorsed by the Cape Fear Realtors.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Throughout my career in the nonprofit sector, in housing and homeownership, I could always count on the realtors to support those initiatives, and it means a lot to me to stay connected and have their endorsement. So
I'm a big fan of realtors, especially my referral partners.
That's right.
But JC, like I said, I appreciate you taking the time. I know it's very busy, crunch time with.
That's right. Thanks for having me.
So thanks for being here.